It is BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. It is time for a new day of True Crime Talk Radio. And once again on the program, I have the pleasure of being joined by Vincent McConnell, who has been a guest previously on this program talking about the Zodiac Killer. But today we are going to be discussing the case of the Golden State Killer, one of the most saddening and horrific cases of the 20th century. However, the Golden State Killer was also one of the biggest true crime discoveries of the 21st century. And I think that this story has revolutionized criminology, and it has also revolutionized how detectives are examining true crime cases. And we are going to talk all about that with Vincent. And are you with me?
Yes, I am.
Vincent, how are you doing?
Good. How are you, Ned?
I'm doing just fine. So, for the audience of Black Box Online Radio, would you like to tell us what first made you curious about the case of the Golden State Killer?
When I first got into the Zodiac Killer mystery, and for a long time, I determined or, thought that this whole case was very, very dark and included a lot of, essay. And because of that, I didn't really look into it. Well, there was a viewer that we both had at one point that was one of the loudest voices I've ever heard about how Joseph DeAngelo may have been the Zodiac Killer. I pretty much wrote this person off and didn't pay much attention to them until one day they told me that they might be able to place DeAngelo in Vallejo in about August of 1968. And if nothing else, that claim was what got me started down the rabbit hole of the whole EARONS situation. And I found the Quester files. And one thing that really drew me to it was that this was a solved case. So we could use a lot of that retrospective lens and that hindsight to get clear answers. And there are many missing, and I'm sure we'll go into it. But we know more about this case than we know about the Zodiac Killer. And as a result of that, I just kept digging and learning and reading. And like you said about how it changed criminal investigation, it definitely taught me a lot.
All right, fascinating. And for the audience, who was the Golden State Killer?
The Golden State Killer is a nickname given to Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. by an author named Michelle McNamara. He was an extremely prolific offender responsible for at least 50 rapes, at least 13 murders, and probably over 100 home invasions between a period of 1974 to 1986. And during this period of time, he was given numerous criminal monikers. The Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and many credible researchers present the opinion that he may have also been some offenders called the Cordova Cat and the Exeter Ransacker.
Yes, and I've heard you talk about that on your YouTube channel. Are those the crimes that occurred in 1973?
Yeah, that's correct.
And what is it about the Golden State Killer mystery that has people so curious? Because it's not only you and I. There's a reason why Michelle McNamara wanted to popularize this case. What do you think that is, though?
Definitely before it was solved, I can see why this would be one of the huge true crime mysteries. We're looking at easily among the top several most prolific offenders of all time. This individual was pretty forensically aware, though not perfectly. And he was able to, it's mind-blowing even to me now that we have it solved, just how prolific this crime spree is, because you're looking at minimum 3 famous criminals that this man became. And I can only imagine that before this case was solved, it was a pretty intriguing little situation for true crime researchers like us. I didn't find it until after it was solved. But I can definitely see, and at the time he was at large too, and I believe law enforcement believed he was alive for almost that entire time. And so I can understand why masses of people wanted to track this guy.
Now, Vincent, you run the channel Nuke Hoax 2024, and when I've been watching your videos, I've gained the impression that you don't like the name Golden State Killer. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think I know Quester has a large article about this called "There Is No Golden State Killer," and I really do second a lot of the stuff Quester says about that. I think it just it's a new, contemporary, and modernized name, and it also kind of glorifies an offender in a sense, because it's really linking him with the state's nickname. There's a lot of people have sensitive opinions about Golden State Killer. I usually just call them EARONS because that was the original law enforcement acronym. But I think it's a little, it just sounds corny to me personally, but that's a preference thing.
And what do you think about Michelle McNamara's intent to give him that name to draw attention to the case? Because as you just said, for a while he was known as East Area Rapist. Then he was known as Original Night Stalker, ONS, so that became EARONS. And she thought that people in the general public, people in the masses, would not comprehend the story about the EARONS. They wouldn't even know what that is. So she thought about giving the name the Golden State Killer as a way to reach a larger amount of people and trying to connect people to the story. Do you think that was a good thing or a bad thing to do?
It probably helped. As we know, the press attention wasn't ultimately what got D'Angelo caught. And it also didn't really even aid in his capture. But as far as bringing widespread attention to the case, it probably was a good idea, because if you Google EARONS murder or something, and then you Google Golden State Killer murder, you're going to get a massive amount of more information about Golden State Killer than you will with EARONS. So I understand her intent. I know there's been some mixed opinions about how she talked about Janelle Cruz and Janelle Cruz's family during the writing of her book. I also am, there's a couple issues. We can go into McNamara if you want, but there's a couple issues with her that I think are questionable and objectionable, and they pertain to DNA evidence and just some of the way that her PR team treated her role in identifying him. Essentially, there's some Y markers of DNA that Michelle McNamara appears to have stolen from Orange County Sheriff's Department, and she didn't get clarification from anyone in law enforcement about whether or not that DNA profile that she had was valid before publishing it in her book and encouraging people to look at any suspect with a German English last name.
Wow, that is a very, very big part of the story. But would you like to talk a little bit more about some of these things that you disagree with Michelle McNamara's choices? And the book we're talking about is, of course, All Be Gone in the Dark, right?
Yes.
Okay, so what would be some things that you disagree with involving her research method?
Definitely, if the stories or the accusations against her are true, that she left Orange County Sheriff's Department with a DNA profile she did not have permission to get, and then proceeded to send people down that particular investigative route. I think that had the potential to harm the case. And like we see with the Zodiac, when you have a lot of sleuths looking in different directions, you end up distracting people and going down rabbit holes that aren't necessarily based in actual crime scene evidence, but instead a misinterpretation of the situation. And the Y markers in the DNA profile that she had led to someone with a German English last name. And of course, we see with more accurate DNA profiles and ultimately the identification that D'Angelo had an Italian last name, and that those routes of investigation were basically meaningless.
Now, on your YouTube channel, Nuke Hoax 2024, one thing that I really like about your presentations is you provide a lot of focus and attention on the victims, and you talk about the victims very favorably in the Golden State Killer case. For example, you've even called Claude Snelling a hero. You said some very praiseworthy things about the Maggioris, and it sounds like you just said something previously about how you didn't like how Michelle McNamara presented the story of one of the victims' families. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Well, the accusations are, and there's been some back and forth about whether this was her or her ghostwriters, but supposedly she was calling Janelle Cruz, what's the word for it? You know how people talk about Darlene Ferrin?
Absolutely.
the same sort of vein, and then supposedly bringing up her mom's drug use and this kind of stuff. I don't know if those accusations are true. I don't know, who said them, whether it was her ghostwriting team, and to what extent those were mentioned. I have to admit that my source in a lot of this information is Gian Quasar of the Quester Files, and I want to make sure that, if we're going to say, oh, this person did this or that, that I clarify that this is according to Quester.
Okay, and do you have any additional comments about All Be Gone in the Dark and Michelle McNamara?
Well, she published an incredible letter, and it was one of the things that I found early on in looking at this case, called Letter to an Old Man. And it's basically addressed to the then unidentified Joseph DeAngelo. And by the end of that article, or that letter, I had goosebumps. It's incredibly well written, and it's just very chilling, very dramatic, very theatrical. You could tell she's a great author. The only thing that concerns me about it is a little bit too much graphic description about his various body parts and some of the raunchier details of the case that I don't think were necessary to publish that article. And it comes off a little bit strange to me.
And what specific detail is strange?
She's talking about his penis, and I think there's details in there that didn't really need to be included. But ultimately, it's a very well written article. I highly recommend anyone check out this. If you just Google letter to the Golden State Killer, you'll find it that way.
Yes, of course. And Michelle McNamara was very active on the internet for years, running her blog prior to the publication of her book. But you mentioned that you first learned about the Golden State Killer case after the mystery had been solved and the killer had been identified. I had a very similar experience. For me, it was around the time of when the headlines were coming out. Like, I follow a lot of different true crime stories, but at that time, Black Box Online Radio was still in its infancy, and I just started getting all of these news headlines about how the Golden State Killer mystery has been solved, and I was really actually quite surprised that somebody like me, who had followed a lot of different true crime cases, had not heard the news. But then this has just affected so many things for not only me as someone who is following true crime stories and following the history of criminology, but just looking at how people are investigating cases in the future. And what exactly was the first moment? When was the first time that you learned about the Golden State Killer? And like, what's the whole process?
I remember hearing about him years ago. I didn't get into true crime until I got into the Zodiac case, which was probably about 3 years ago. And I remember, though, like seeing him in court and all this stuff. I didn't really pay any attention. I didn't deep dive the case at all until Lisa Cesari was on both of our channels claiming that he was Zodiac. And that's kind of what led me down that rabbit hole. But it's really amazing the way that this case was so largely unheard of, because this is truly one of the most prolific serial offenders of all time.
Yes, and we have to give a shout out to Aunt Lisa. And ultimately, yes, she had to be banned from this channel for spamming. And that really is the major reason. People are allowed to post things that they want in the comment section here on Black Box Online Radio. And when I do live streams, people are allowed to put stuff in the live chats. But she was just sending people like 7 or 8 replies to every single comment that they would leave, not to mention on social media. That stuff isn't completely welcome. But to everybody else who's listening to this, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want, and please respectfully put some stuff in the comment section about the Golden State Killer. If you have something to say, for larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. But Vincent, I really wanted to use this as an opportunity to talk to you about the victims. For example, multiple times on your channel, you've said some very praiseworthy things about Claude Snelling. Would you like to tell us his story and what you think?
Well, yeah, I completely. I want to point out to everybody, this is such an honorable, truly amazing man that gave his life for the protection of his daughter. Between 1974 and 1975, there emerged in the small town Visalia a very interesting cat burglar, ransacker, and apparently sexually motivated offender that began breaking into houses, stealing the piggy banks of the children that lived there, ripping up family photos, ransacking the bedrooms and scattering clothes and pouring fluids all over them. And this individual was extremely prolific. I believe on the night of November 30th, 1974, if that's correct, he broke into 12 houses and ransacked them in one night. And I remember hearing that and thinking, how in the world is something like this even possible? Well, in early 1975, there was an unidentified individual peeping and prowling the Snelling household. Claude Snelling chased this person away successfully and returned to his home. On the morning of September 11th, 1975, at about 2:17 in the morning, Claude Snelling's daughter, Elizabeth Snelling, awoke to the full weight of someone lying on top of her. At first, thinking it was a prank by her brother, she went to open her eyes, and as soon as she did, she was met with the glaring stare of a intruder in the home. This individual told her, "Don't scream, you're coming with me," covered her mouth, and attempted to lead her out of the house. And after he reached the outside area of the house, Claude Snelling had awoken from the sound and went running after the man and said, "What are you doing with my daughter?" This situation has been kind of misinterpreted by a lot of people because it's used to bolster the opinion that D'Angelo only killed in self-preservation and self-defense, when in fact what really happened was D'Angelo stopped on the front yard of that house, turned around and waited for Claude Snelling to reach the door, and then shot him twice, once in the arm and once in the chest. Claude Snelling then ran back into his house, alerted his wife, said, "I've been shot, call the police," and charged back out through the front door into gunfire, where he ultimately collapsed in the doorway. And it's just such a heroic and tragic end for him. He was a 41-year-old professor at the local College of the Sequoias, where D'Angelo actually did some police exams there prior to becoming a police officer. And Snelling essentially gave his life and saved his daughter's life in the process. No one really knows where D'Angelo intended to take her, though there have been some hypotheses about that. But ultimately, if not for his actions that night, his daughter would have been abducted and possibly killed.
Right, because on your channel, I've also heard you talk about how there are lots of myths that people have about the Golden State Killer case, and you've just brought up one about how the Golden State Killer only killed out of necessity, which you have just disputed. But another one is that the Golden State Killer did not abduct people. And would you like to continue with that?
Yeah, I think Elizabeth Snelling is a textbook example of him attempting to abduct a victim out of her home. There's also some non-canonical crimes. The murders of Jennifer R. Moore and Donna Richmond that many believe, including Tony Reed, the researcher, that were actually committed by D'Angelo. They were women that either went missing or were killed in Visalia around this time. And we also see during the period of time around Jennifer R. Moore's celebration of life services, we see a massive uptick of Visalia ransacker activity. And his website is called, and this is all numbers, 12-26-75. It's an incredible resource for information about the events in Visalia at that time.
Okay, and I want to remind everybody that I am talking to Vincent McConnell, the host of Nuke Hoax 2024, and I also have several different episodes about the Golden State Killer here on Black Box Online Radio, including an interview that I did with Mike Morford, who is the co-author of The Case of the Golden State Killer. And prior to our discussion here, Vincent, I went back and I listened to some of my older episodes, including the interview with Morph, and he brought up something that was very interesting, and it's an aspect of the mystery that I don't hear talked about too much, because you touched upon an interesting part of the case, and that is that D'Angelo is accused of 12 break-ins, 12 invasions in one night, and what Mike Morford was simply asking was, when did this guy sleep? Because he had a family, he had a full-time job in law enforcement, and it's almost as if he just didn't have time to even close his eyes if he's going to be prowling, sometimes literally all night. And not only that, but also hiding in the bushes and sitting around for 4 hours waiting for people to come home. And do you ever find peculiarities in the case like that?
Yeah, that's very strange. I think it's possible to account for a situation like that with the illicit use of stimulants or some kind of a manic mental illness break, or both. but definitely Morford is right about that, because we are looking at someone who is extremely prolific. It's almost as if in that entire 12-year period from 74 to 86, minus the 5-year break, and we'll get into that with the Night Stalker situation. This guy was almost constantly prowling, breaking into houses, raping, attacking, stalking, doing all this behavior. He's making phone calls to future, past, and potential victims, and it's very strange. I agree with him completely.
Right, and what Morph was speculating on, or just trying to figure out, was that perhaps D'Angelo was working in law enforcement, and he would just find a way to take his car somewhere, maybe park under a tree for 3 or 4 hours in the afternoon, and that was his only time to sleep, because it seemed like he was very active throughout the nights. And this is what Morph really wanted to convey, that when he's going out on these prowling sessions, he is actively prowling, and it's not like, well, okay, well, he's going to sleep for 3 hours here, and then he does some criminal activity, then he goes to sleep for 3 hours again. According to the evidence, it appeared that he was continuously on the prowl, and I think that is just well, it's sickening in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it's just a different component of the mystery to me. What do you think?
Well, sometimes if we look at a person's life story, it can be surprising to us to see all the achievements of a person and how many things they can do in their life. And I think a lot of that comes from this illusion, essentially, of hindsight, where when we talk about the period 1974 to 1986, it takes about 10 seconds to say that by word. But you look there, and that's 12 entire years of activity. Sometimes it can be easy to overlook just how much time a person really has during their day. But he was very, very active in these behaviors. He would develop routines of, when people were leaving the house, when their family members left the house. There were prior break-ins before some of these attacks. And I want to also mention that there are some EAR attacks where they appear to have been committed by someone who didn't bring pants to the scene. And it makes you wonder if maybe he had taken his police officer's uniform off and was prowling naked so that his police officer pants wouldn't be recognized.
I mean, that's entirely possible. But I said that one of your real strengths is that you have said a lot of praiseworthy things about the victims, and I particularly like your video on the Maggiores. I think it's called The Maggiore Murders, is just what the YouTube users can find in the title of the video. And would you like to talk about that story?
Yeah, it's a very sad, very tragic situation. Basically, on February 2nd, 1978, an Air Force couple, Sergeant Brian Maggiore and his new wife, Katie Maggiore, were walking their dog Thumper in Rancho Cordova. Some sort of encounter. Some people say it's a confrontation. Some people say there was a direct sort of face-off between Brian Maggiore and D'Angelo, which we really don't know what happened, because nobody survived and he's not talking. But when responders arrived at that crime scene, they found Brian Maggiore shot, suffering from a gunshot wound to the chest that exited his neck. And then they also found his wife, Katie Maggiore, who had been shot once in the top back of the head. And it just appeared to be very senseless. At the time, nobody knew for sure that it was the East Area rapist, but there were elements within the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department that were quite convinced. At the scene, there was very little physical or forensic evidence except for a pair of blue shoelaces that were tied in a granny knot, a pre-tied ligature sitting a couple feet from Brian Maggiore's body. The offender at that crime scene then escaped on foot to an area in sort of that northern sector of that community, and then essentially disappeared. He was seen by a couple people while leaving the crime scene. Some of them saw him possibly with a mask, and some of them saw him without a mask. And for many years, it just wasn't known for sure that this was an EAR crime until later. Detective Ken Clark of the Sacramento County Sheriff's did an info dump where he revealed a lot of the holdback information and disputed the two suspects theory that had arisen from some witness statements given during that time. And it was a very senseless murder. It has many shades of Zodiac type behavior where there's an unarmed couple gunned down at random in a neighborhood at night with a pistol. But we really don't know whether there was a confrontation or whether there wasn't. Katie Maggiore appears to have had a stalker before this attack occurred. It's largely believed that that stalker was D'Angelo, especially retrospectively. But it was just some senseless double murder that happened one night.
Now, with the story of the Maggiores, a lot of people have this belief about that case that one of the victims was targeted first, and then the second victim was targeted purely to be silenced, or so there wouldn't be a surviving witness, because it's almost as if D'Angelo just trailed down the second victim. And as you said, though, that begs the question about why commit the first shooting to begin with. And do you have any thoughts about that, or do you think that D'Angelo wanted to kill both victims, or what exactly was the whole reason for the murder, or is it just purely senseless, as you possibly brought up?
I don't know. I've wondered that a long time too, because if he's doing it in self-preservation, then he has, a quote unquote excuse for why they were chased down and shot. But there's many other possibilities that it could have just been he was frustrated and wanted to shoot someone. As far as circumstantial substance towards the hypothesis that there was some form of identification possible, it's important to note that Katie Maggiore was specifically chased down and shot quite unnecessarily, because he could have shot Brian Maggiore and then turned and ran away. But he didn't do that. He shot Brian Maggiore and then chased Katie Maggiore and shot her down too. So it does lean towards the idea that maybe she could identify him. But at this time, it appears we just won't know why that would happen.
Yes, and perhaps we will not get all of the answers, but this reminds me of another video on Nuke Hoax 2024 where you said we should waterboard the EARONS for answers. And that might be a little bit satirical on your part, but would you like to tell us about that video?
Oh, I mean, why not? I I argued that who's going to defend him? Of course, people say, all human rights and stuff. I was, it's very disturbing what he did in general. And when we get into these original Night Stalker cases coming up, it's a very dark situation. I think that was, like you say, there's some satire in that, and there's also some need for retaliation going there. And it would also help to give us some answers. Why were the Maggiore shot? Why, maybe what crimes were actually his? What answers could we get out of him? And maybe the law enforcement will have another idea instead of enhanced interrogation. But what I will say is I would not be particularly offended if someone decided to do enhanced interrogation of D'Angelo to get these answers. I think they'd be very valuable answers. But that was mostly, like you say, satire.
Well, yes, of course, but I completely saw your point. However, though, Joseph D'Angelo was famously a member of law enforcement. He reportedly even worked for an anti-burglary task force. And I want to know, what do you think his role in law enforcement played in the creation of his crimes?
It's very possible that he went into law enforcement just to learn how to commit crime better. He was on the Exeter anti-burglary task force. He studied police procedures and tactics and so forth, and it helped him to become forensically aware. There is an EAR crime where they attempted to stake out the house that had previously experienced prowling or potential EAR activity, and the notice of that stakeout was extremely classified. It didn't go out to very many people, but on the night that they went to that house expecting EAR to return, he simply never did. So he may have been using his position in law enforcement purely for inside information, or there's deeper psychological potential reasons as to why someone would want to go into a position of authority who then later binds and beats people to death. So I don't know. I think you'd have to ask D'Angelo, why did you become a cop?
Well, absolutely. But as I understand, he isn't talking that much about the reasons why he did things, or he is simply just not talking so much about all of the secrets that he has. And I think that's what prompted your video on why we should waterboard him. So I would like to ask you a question, and you can speculate as much as you want or as little as you want. And I want to know, what do you think was driving this person to kill and commit the home invasions and the SA attacks? What do you think was the motivation for D'Angelo to do what he did?
He's probably just an unhinged psychopath that he definitely enjoyed killing. If you look at his situation in contrast to someone like the Zodiac, who pretty much did the bare minimum that he did to ensure deaths, D'Angelo quite literally beat people until their head was simply not there and they had to be identified by dental records. So he's a very psychotic individual. I think he's a coward for not giving us answers, even after being caught. I'd like to see him at least attempt to clarify some of these issues, but sometimes I think there's just people in this world that are so bad that there is no real explanation for what they do, for what they do. So.
And when you said there's no explanation, do you mean that it's just about sadism, that it's just about power and domination and a self-serving agenda?
Yeah, probably. He appears to have had some resentments against a broken engagement that he had. I'm sure there's a lot of inner hatred with this individual. I kind of think there has to be, to do what he did to some of those original Night Stalker victims. There's probably just nothing to truly comprehend there for why someone would do this.
Well, you just brought up his failed engagement, and can you please tell us more about her?
Yeah, he got engaged to a lady named Bonnie Colwell in, I believe, 1969 or so. And they were together for about a year or two. And at some point during his abusive treatment of her, he went to her and asked her to help him cheat on an abnormal psychology exam, I guess maybe for college or for the police academy. And when she refused to do it and broke off the engagement, he returned with a gun and tried to force her into marriage with him. And she refused to do that too. And during some of the EAR attacks, we later found that the offender was crying and saying, "I hate you, Bonnie," during his rapes.
Right, and perhaps that wasn't a genuine form of affection, but rather that was just someone who was very mad about the rejection, or someone did something that he was not in control of. Because it's my understanding that these psychopathic individuals don't actually have feelings for, well, anybody else, but they simply are upset that they are not having a certain experience on their own. And do you agree or disagree with that?
It's hard to tell. I can't say for sure what amount of empathy or remorse a guy like D'Angelo is going to feel. Some of the EAR victims said that sobbing seemed very genuine. And I also, I don't know. I'm not screwed up to that extent, so I don't know if someone like that has feelings. He apparently apologized for his actions in court, but of course that's a little too little, too late. And I don't know. I mean, maybe the fact that he won't talk to his family, he won't talk to the public, is a sign of that shame and remorse that he might have. But I don't know.
And it is quite a mystery just unraveling the thinking of someone who did all of these horrible acts. But I would actually like to shift gears right now and talk about a different aspect of the story. And one of the individuals that has become heavily attached to this case is an investigator named Paul Holes. And on your channel, you speak very highly of Paul Holes. Would you like to tell the audience about him?
Yeah. So while he was working as an investigator for Contra Costa County, Paul Holes discovered a dusty file cabinet, and in one of those drawers was a file labeled EAR. He dug into this situation, and he was pretty surprised to find that it had gone unsolved, and hundreds of investigators had attempted to take a crack at this thing for decades, and no one was able to really get anywhere. When DNA technology began advancing, he was fortunate enough to have some DNA samples from the Contra Costa County rapes, and working with Mary Hong, a DNA specialist and analyst at Irvine, I think she's Orange County Sheriff's Department. He was able to link a series of unsolved homicides in Southern California to some of the rapes up north. And in 2001, the link was announced as East Area Rapist Original Night Stalker. Before that time, nobody knew for sure that this was the same guy. And there was even some discussion back and forth as to whether or not these original Night Stalker crimes were linked to each other. Later on, as DNA technology improved and as Paul Holes got closer to his retirement, he was able to convert the DNA profiles they had for this offender to a type of profile that could be submitted to civilian databases, and he submitted the DNA profile to gedmatch.com. From here, they identified either a third or fourth cousin, I believe it's a third cousin, with a common ancestor related to D'Angelo going back to the early 1800s. They then took that relative, built his family tree backwards, and then built the family tree forwards again until they arrived at a couple suspects or persons of interest that could be circumstantially and geographically linked to the EAR crimes. And ultimately, Joseph D'Angelo was identified this way. And I think it's been an absolutely revolutionary methodology in identifying these offenders, because as we see with the Idaho case that happened in 2022, they were able to narrow in on Brian Koberger allegedly with investigative genetic genealogy in only a matter of a couple weeks. And so, like all good science, there's a streamlining and just a period where it becomes more efficient, more effective. And I think it's got a lot of these cold case people running scared, because now with very minimal DNA, they're able to catch people rather quickly.
Absolutely. And I used to follow the show Case Cracked on the Lord and Arts channel, which would tell the story of how true crime cases were solved. And the host of that program actually said, well, I think I have to reshape the entire segment, because the answer to almost every story that we've been covering is genetic genealogical DNA testing, which is done in a very similar way to what you just laid out with the Golden State Killer case. And that's why I said at the beginning that this has been one of the most revolutionary stories in the history of criminology, definitely in the last 10 years. I think perhaps it is the most revolutionary case. But right now, though, Vincent, I would like to shift gears once again. And I would like to know, what do you think about the Golden State Killer, Zodiac Killer connection? You talked about it a little bit, but I've found that you've had a big reversal about this, and you've talked about it on your YouTube channel a lot. It seems like at first you completely thought it was out of the question, but now you're more open-minded, and you think that there might actually be a chance that the Golden State Killer and the Zodiac Killer were the same person?
I would be surprised, because it would be extremely prolific on D'Angelo's part to be yet another famous murderer. But I want to point out something interesting, a couple things really, but we'll go back to the Visalia ransacker in 1975. Every time the Visalia ransacker was observed, it appears that witnesses described him as having a very large and unusually round face, which we hear the same thing going into the Zodiac case from the Blue Rock Springs incident, from Michael Mageau's witness statements, and then the Pierce Donald Falk said the same thing. That's a very weak link. I don't think that we can use that to establish that he's the Zodiac Killer, but there's been a lot of mythology about how exactly D'Angelo was committing these murders. And if you look at Claude Snelling and you look at the Maggiores, especially Claude Snelling, because we do have some concrete data to go off of there, that when he escaped the Snelling household and shot Claude Snelling, he stopped and waited for Claude Snelling to arrive at the doorway, turned around with the gun, and shot him. He could have left. He could have ran away. It doesn't appear he was doing that purely out of self-preservation. It appears he was doing it out of aggression and maybe a sense of revenge. And it's possible that the Maggiores are the same situation. People think, oh, he only killed indoors. Well, that's not true. He shot the Maggiores down outside at random at night with a pistol. I wouldn't rule him out. I would be extremely surprised if it's the same offender. People say that D'Angelo didn't attempt to gain recognition for his crimes, and that's not true either. He wrote a letter to a TV station in Sacramento claiming to be the East Area rapist and deserving pest. He made phone calls to the Sacramento County sheriffs, and I think that's based on misinterpretations of exactly how he was killing. And people like to say there's a sexual component to all the crimes, and that's not necessarily true with the Maggiores, but it is the case with most of them.
But one big thing that I've noticed about the Zodiac Golden State Killer connection is the Lake Berryessa hooded costume, which had a very different function than what the Golden State Killer did. The Lake Berryessa hood that was worn by the Zodiac Killer when he attacked Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard was done for two reasons. One was for signature and one was for MO. Signature meaning it carried the symbol of the Zodiac, and it was something where he could where to his own satisfaction to declare that he was the Zodiac. He didn't say those words. MO would mean that it concealed his identity. And with the Golden State Killer, I don't see any of those behaviors. As I understand, the Golden State Killer primarily wore a ski mask, although people did see him without his mask on. That's why we have multiple composites of the Golden State Killer, but it seems like he was primarily wearing a mask for only the MO reasons, just to conceal his identity. And if he were the Zodiac Killer, one thing I've wondered is why wouldn't he wear the Zodiac symbol on his chest? Why wouldn't he include anything that would be more similar to the Lake Berryessa hood? Why wouldn't he commit the crimes more similarly to the way that the Zodiac committed the crimes? And I know those are just questions, but any idea on a response?
There appear to be some East Area Rapist cases where the ski mask was handmade. And at one point, I think based upon the tightness of the mask, and this might be at Danville in 1979, shortly before he became the original Night Stalker, or is considered a precursor to the original Night Stalker attack, where the victim survived. They were able to use the tight-fitting mask of the offender to make a composite or make some guesses about what his head shape and his face might look like. Which is interesting you point out, because the Zodiac mask would defeat that purpose. So it is a reversal of criminal escalation patterns, but we see that too with the Visalia Ransacker to the East Area Rapist, because the Visalia Ransacker appears to be wearing tennis shoes that don't make much noise. They're very much more agile. And then for about the first 8 East Area Rapist attacks, he's wearing a waffle stomper type hiking boot before eventually reverting back to tennis shoes again. And this is interesting because if it's the same offender, it appears to be a regression and then a progression again of the exact same modus operandi. When at the Lake Berryessa attack, people like to talk about the way that the Zodiac bound the victims. Zodiac brought pre-cut lengths of clothesline to that crime scene, tossed some to Cecilia Shepard and told her that I need to get you tied up. So he ordered her to tie up Brian Hartnell, and then he went and tied up Cecilia Shepard and then readjusted Brian Hartnell's bindings. And this is very, very significant in the EARONS case, because the EAR and the original Night Stalker, or the EARONS in general, did this exact same thing at almost every one of those canonical EAR crimes where a couple was involved. But there's a lot of mystery there. That's why I think it would be surprising if it's the same offender. But I think a lot of the way that people are trying to claim with absolute certainty it's not the same guy is probably not valid thinking.
Well, fair enough, because I think that one of the biggest reasons why people think that the Golden State Killer and the Zodiac Killer are not the same person is the MO. That's what you will see in all the discussions, even on older episodes of Black Box Online Radio. That's what I'm talking about the changes in modus operandi. But with the Zodiac case, you know this better than anyone. The DNA evidence is questionable. The fingerprint evidence might be a little bit more reliable, but there really isn't a lot of forensic evidence that's been left behind. And I had Mike Morford on for that interview, and he was talking about how a key difference between the Golden State Killer investigations is because of the SA attacks, the Golden State Killer left behind so much semen DNA partnered with saliva DNA that was on beer cans and so on, and the Zodiac just, perhaps by his own luck, did not leave that type of DNA behind. I mean, the Zodiac didn't know about DNA technology in the 1960s. It just happened that way. And, I mean, do you have any additional comments on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if maybe he escalated to sexual motivations. But there's just weird aspects of the whole EAR situation where it seems like he'll regress in something with MO and then he'll revert to it. Like at original Night Stalker crimes, we have some where he takes the bindings, some where he doesn't take the bindings. And this shows a thwarting of forensic investigation. the patterns are so unpredictable. And it's much like the Zodiac. There's not really an MO with the Zodiac either. Like, of course, Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs are pretty similar. Then you have Lake Berryessa, and it's just a completely different crime. And then you have Presidio Heights, which is very different from those other shootings. He's driving around with the victim in the car. He steals a piece of his shirt. There's all this weird stuff going on. I don't think it's so easy to say Zodiac even had a clear-cut MO, really, although there are similarities.
But I also heard you talk about this on your YouTube channel, where you said something to the effect of an explanation for the changes in the MO from the Golden State Killer and the Zodiac Killer was that when the Zodiac crimes were occurring, the East Area rapist was reportedly with Bonnie, and he was trying to make that relationship work, but he's in a romantic relationship. And then after he has the falling out with Bonnie, then perhaps his sexual feelings manifested in a very bizarre way, and that began to alter the course of his criminal trajectory. And did I get that right?
It's good thing you brought that up. I'd forgotten about that. I think I was wrong, Ned. I think that was based on a misinterpretation of the timeline of his engagement. It appears that I have to check the notes again on this, when he actually got the engagement and then when that broke off. I think that's 1970. So I might have just been operating off of disinformation, misinformation, or a failure to correctly interpret the information I was reading.
Okay, and no worries about that. However, there is another true crime case that you've talked about briefly on your channel that gets heavily connected to the Golden State Killer story, and that is the case of Mr. Cruel, who is an unidentified serial offender from Australia. And some people even believe that Mr. Cruel and the Golden State Killer are the same person. Mr. Cruel was someone who committed sexual assaults. He wore different types of masks. He committed at least one murder, the murder of Carmen Chen. But what exactly do you think about that story?
Well, supposedly law enforcement has officially ruled out that possible connection. I think that was more popular as a connection before he was identified. And it seems that at the present date, law enforcement has squashed that.
Yes, I agree with that, but do you have any observations about the Mr. Cruel case?
I haven't looked into it too deeply. It's definitely a lot more, there's more sexual assault going on there than there is murder. I do think he was probably responsible for Carmen Chan, but I don't know much about that situation.
Oh, yes, and one of the widely held beliefs is that Carmen Chen was murdered because perhaps Mr. Cruel wasn't even set on murdering any victim. It's just he wanted to commit crimes, and he wanted to either keep a mask on or keep the victims in a way where they would not be able to identify him, and that Carmen Chan perhaps recognized him, or that she saw him without his mask came off, and that's why she was murdered. But I believe that you're right, and I mean, it's my understanding that the law enforcement took this case seriously, that the link between the Golden State Killer and Mr. Cruel in Australia, but ultimately they determined that it was not the same offender, and probability would not be on anyone's side. You'd have to have some very specific reasons to look at a serial killer in North America, connecting them to a serial rapist in Australia, and to actually not just list the similarities, but say that this is indeed the same person. And it appears that he has been ruled out, but it's a saddening story all the same. And I have a standalone episode about Mr. Cruel here on Black Box Online Radio, which I invite everyone to listen to if they are curious about the story. But as far as the actions and activities of the Golden State Killer go, I would really like to know more about what you think in regards to some parts of the investigation, because, Vincent, when I was looking at the timeline, it was actually because of one of your videos. I saw that you were talking about the Maggiores and Claude Snelling, and somebody asked you a question in the live chat, and they said, how many murders did he commit prior to the Maggiores? And then you thought for a second, and you said, only Claude Snelling. And I decided to look at the timeline, and what I began to notice, Vincent, was that there was the murder of Claude Snelling, then there are the Maggiore murders, and then it appears that there is this almost eruption of homicides committed by the Golden State Killer around the turn of the decade, like 1979, 1980, and thereabouts. Firstly, have you made that similar observation?
Oh yeah, it's absurd. To give the viewers an understanding of this, I wrote down in my limited preparation for our discussion here, I wrote down some of the dates of these original Night Stalker homicides. You have the murders of Dr. Offerman and Manning, which is December 30th, 1979. Then the Charlene and Lyman Smith murder in Ventura, and that's March 13th, 1980. Then you have the Harrington murders in Laguna Niguel is August 19th, 1980. Manuela Watoon is February 16th, 1981. Gregory Sanchez and Sherry Domingos is July 27th, 1981. And then you have what appears to be a 5-year gap, but there may be stuff we don't know about in that 5 years. Then he goes and kills Janelle Cruz, an 18-year-old girl living in Irvine, on May 4th, 1986. And that's basically 10 murders from December 30th of 79 to May 4th of 86. And you're definitely right. It's just a massive eruption of killing. I think it's possible that once he really got a feel for or a taste for murder, he just couldn't help himself and went on a rampage. But I also see a number of non-canonicals listed by Tony Reed on his website, 122675, for some of these unsolved Placer County homicides that may have been occurring during that 1981 to 1986 gap, and they just haven't been canonically linked.
Right, because that's a very bizarre gap for serial killers. And again, Mike Morford, in the case of the Golden State Killer, talks about how there were theorized and hypothetical stressors in the killer's life prior to the identification of Joseph DeAngelo, where they're making these psychological profiles. They're thinking that he probably had some life-altering events in 1981 and 86. And I'm just going off of memory here, Vincent, but did the Golden State Killer have children in both 1981 and 1986?
I believe in 86, at the time of the murder of Janelle Cruz, his wife was 7 months pregnant. And I think I know he had another daughter, so it might have been in 1981. I'm not sure. But that's a weird gap. I completely agree. It's very possible that he just went and did some killing up north and then came back down, and we haven't really officially linked those yet.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the stuff that Mike Morford talked about was that the profilers are talking about marriages, children, new types of employment, a promotion, and that it's normal for serial killers to respond to major life events in particular ways. And it's also very saddening because you just have to think that, okay, someone is about to have a baby, therefore they want to go out and commit murder. But this is something that I think Joseph DeAngelo's story has just shared with the world, that yes, people do sick and twisted things.
Yeah, it's. I mean, the nature of these murders, these original Night Stalker murders, are absolutely brutal. The Quester files can give viewers a really nice breakdown of exactly how those were committed, but most of them are by bludgeon. And as the criminal progressed in his activities, he began finding ways to make the murders cleaner, such as covering victims while beating them. And he's doing just hitting them in excess, and it's a very up close, aggressive, personal method of murder. This is a very, very sick, twisted person. And I think that speaks to us. Remember earlier, we were trying to figure out like aspects of his psychology. I mean, how can you, like you say, someone's got a wife that's pregnant with a baby and their response is to go out and beat someone to death is just absolutely insane to me.
Oh, yes, and to me too. But a question for you is, do you believe that the final Golden State Killer crime occurred in 1986, or do you think he committed homicides after that?
That's what law enforcement believes. I know they, like the Zodiac case, they have all this holdback and they have information we don't believe. So we do have to kind of take their word for it. He was getting older at that time. I think he was about 40. He's 40 years old at the time of the murder of Janelle Cruz. And it's possible that testosterone just began waning for him, or it's possible that his child became a larger priority or use of his time and energy and attention. But I would have to say, just to be on the safe side, I'd say if law enforcement says this is the final canonical, then I second that until we see something very significant to indicate otherwise.
Right. For example, Ann Penn has hypothesized that the Golden State Killer also committed the Granite Bay murders in the early 90s. And then there are other crimes that he's been accused of throughout that decade, but he would hold back on any type of statement like that, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's just people like to theorize, and they a lot of times in this community there's a massive confusion between what someone thinks and then what someone can prove. And recently I've been kind of mentioning this on my channel to people, like a good sort of reference standard to go by is if you think something in a true crime case, how willing and how ready would you be to actually bet your life that that's true? And you find that a lot of these people's hypotheses that they're so sure of, they go, oh, well, I don't think I would do that. And, it's important to follow things we can prove versus what we think, I think. And it's good to have hypotheses. It's good to have a theory. It's good to try to get answers. But it's important to remember, too, that just because we think something doesn't mean that's what happened.
Okay, and I have two final questions for you. The first one would be, what do you think is a good resource for people who want to learn more about the Golden State Killer mystery? And where can people find additional material about the Golden State Killer case? What resources would you recommend?
Quester Files is so far the best that I've found. The Quester Files, I believe the domain is either the Quester Files or questerfiles.com. And he has a breakdown of every single canonical attack, starting with EAR crimes and going all the way into original Night Stalker. And there's a whole, HTML page for each one of those crimes. And there's like 50 sexual assaults, 13 murders and all this stuff that he really breaks down nicely. There's a website called VisaliaRansacker.com that goes into detail with that. But everybody's been really tight-lipped. We can't get information out of D'Angelo, and for some strange reason, in 6 years, law enforcement has not released all their information either.
And right now, Vincent, I would like to give you the floor and ask, do you have any final send-off for the listeners of Black Box Online Radio? Where can people find your stuff? And what can people expect from you in the future? And any final concluding thoughts or ideas about the Golden State Killer case?
Well, about this case in particular, I want to point out that there are aspects of it that we can use to make some assumptions about Zodiac. I've talked about the whole Berryessa thing and how or why he would wear a costume and why he might have worn a wig under a mask, such as being spotted prior to perpetration of the crime. But it's important to be careful doing that because we're taking one case and trying to assume things about another case based upon that, and that can be very murky territory to go down. As you said, people can always go to Nuke Hoax 2024. I don't know what in the world will be covered next. A lot of times I'll just do live streams walking somewhere. And then I like having the interactive community because people are always prompting me with ideas or questions in there. But I think with everybody in this community, just try to follow the science. Don't be so sure that your hypothesis is true just because you think it. And keep plugging away. And I think that eventually we might have an answer to Zodiac too, in the same way that we've got to solve in this case with DNA or with some kind of information we don't know about yet.
Vincent McConnell, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ned.